Good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Humanities at SFU, also the director of the Institute for the Humanities. Given me tremendous pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for our event, which is a launch of Johal's book, Ecological Metapolitics, Alain Badiou and the Anthropocene. It's an especial pleasure to be moderating the session tonight, and that's for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that Am and I, we work a lot together and have done for the last couple of years. Recently he described me as one of his favorite people at SFU, along with a friend over here, Clint Burnham, and so that was a great honor. But also, and more importantly, because I had taken a look at this book in its earliest stages as it was developing as a dissertation for the European Graduate School that was actually written under the direction of Alain Badiou. I commented on it and have been quite interested to see its development, and really pleased to see now that it's coming out in a book form. So just a quick plug that there are copies at the back. This is a launch and you can purchase copies of the book at the back of the gallery for $20. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm just going to say a couple of things about the format for tonight, and then we're going to go right into our discussion. So we have essentially a panel of 5 people, 4 of whom are here in the room. And as you can see, one of our panelists is beaming in at a very early hour from Berlin. I'll be introducing all of the panelists in just a second. But I'll just say a quick word about the format. Each panelist will have 5 to 7 minutes to articulate their extremely cutting critiques of Am's arguments. After which time Am will have a few minutes to respond, and they're all going to retire to the pub, which is to say the Black Frog, at approximately 8:30. I'd say between 8:30 and 8:35, something around there. Yeah, that's the format. I'm just going to introduce our panelists then. You just have to excuse me if I'm a little flustered tonight, because the offices of the Institute were broken into over the weekend, and I think it's still too early to rule CSIS out. I think there's always that possibility. So I'm just thinking about my options right now. So let me just introduce our panelists for this evening in the order in which they'll be speaking. So the first speaker tonight is Kavita Reddy, who's a graduate student in the Department of Humanities, a student of mine, I'm very pleased to say, at SFU. Her graduate work focuses on Marxism critical theory. Her primary interest is in studying traditional theoretical traditions of Marxist philosophy, ecological thought, and the assumptions of developmental discourse. She's interested in examining the environmental limits and subsequent implications to the boundless expansion of capital. She plans to examine these limits with specific reference to the contemporary extractive practices within Canada. Our second speaker is a speaker who is beaming in from Berlin via Skype, Patricia Reed, who is an artist and writer. Exhibitions have included those at the WIT, in the Netherlands, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Württembergische Kunstverein, the Ordain Gallery, 0047, NO, amongst others. As a writer, she's contributed to several books and periodicals, including Dea Ex Machina, Mold Magazine, Accelerate, The Acceleration Reader, Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, Volume 2, Intangible Economies, Cognitive Architecture, Philip, and so on. She sits on the board and teaches at the New Center for Research and Practice and is part of the Laboria Cubonics Exo-Feminist Working Group. So she'll be our second speaker, and then after that we have, I have to find my third speaker here, right here, Glen Coulthard, who most of you will, I'm sure, know, is an assistant professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies and the Department of Political Science at UBC. He's a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. And then fourth is Amelia Kennedy, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at UBC. Amelia's research interests include environmental politics and policy, geographies of energy and climate change policy, politics of technology. Amelia is editing her dissertation on climate change policy and carbon capture technology in Alberta, Canada. And last but not least, we have Mr. Matt Hern. Taking his task on this panel probably a little bit too seriously, Matt spent large chunks of the past week reading Badu so he could respond more fulsomely to Am's book. Approximately 3/4 of the time, he had no fucking idea what Badu was talking about, and thus ended up in the long detours trying to understand set theory, Althusserian structuralism, synchronic versus diachronic ontologies, and much else. Success was fleeting and contingent. Reading Am's book after the struggle, however, was a lot of fun, engaging, and opened up some new ways of thinking, seeing for Matt. Maybe this constitutes a Baduian event. Well, without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor over to Kavita Reddy. Please join me in welcoming her.
Okay. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Am for inviting me to speak on this panel and inviting me to be part of this fantastic book launch. Ecological metapolitics is really addressing what I think an extremely important moment that brings to the forefront the intertwining nature of social and natural domination perpetuated by the logic of capital. What first drew me to the study of anthropogenic climate change is that it's a problem that not only affects all of human civilization, but also establishes a limit to capital's unfettered growth, making visible a culture premised on domination and dispossession. This is significant because it creates a moment for reassessment spurring change mobilized through collective action by opening up discussion on what it means to be human. The seemingly seamless process of capital shatters, demanding an analysis of its inherent dynamics, a sort of de-reification. What a historical analysis of this development of capital reveals is that as a civilization, we've gone from a genocidal 20th century to a 21st century in ecological crisis. I argue that state-sanctioned policy and governance has not progressed, rather continues a pattern of violence for the sake of value expansion masquerading as progress. Nonetheless, ecological metapolitics is significant because it not only works through the inherent tension between the world we create and the limits of the earth, but also provides a model to which we might better understand the problems at hand by clearing a platform for meaningful discussion. I'm going to quote what I feel is a programmatic sentence in this book. Ecological metapolitics proposes that in their contemporary usage, the terms political philosophy, environmental ethics, democracy, and human rights are not relevant to the question of ecology, insofar as they've become captured language, valorized by the limits imposed by democratic materialism. It is not an argument that we should give up on these words or that language, but rather an argument for returning them to their proper meaning outside the state, and thereby opening up in them the possibility of a new political invention through the imminent rupture of creative novelty. Within the problem of ecology, this is an attempt to create an outside. Embedded in this idea is that through the inertia of the event and the resulting fidelity of the newly created subject, the moment from the impossible to the possible can be constructed regarding the question of ecology today. This really highlights to what I think is of utmost importance, which is a call to re-inhabit the existing symbols and places, or as you state, Am, of the forceful occupation of empty place. With this comes the potentiality of different worlds premised on localized, specific, and singular qualities. A place prior to re-inhabitation is empty insofar as it is hollowed out of all inherent meaning and reduced to a system component within the overall scheme of value expansion premised on exchange and surplus. An example is the receding glaciers. Instead of appreciating the ecological implications to such an event, states controlling the circumpolar region are attempting to delineate boundaries and established sovereignty for the purpose of securing legitimacy for seabed drilling for petrochemical extraction, which overshadows the implications of rapidly melting permafrost as a result of burning the hydrocarbons retrieved from these endeavors. Another specific point brought up by ecological metapolitics is how thought and reality are active processes, not illuminations of an ossified universal truth. Anthropogenic climate change, in this sense, demonstrates a moment embodied in an event. This event is not meant to lead to the creation of another truth, but an active moment, opening up the space for a chance of the new to come into existence by embracing the multiplicity or the plurality of place. This new existence is achieved outside the state, which is not to be confused, as you state, a pure non-relation to the state, rather a subtraction allowing for an invention of a new political subject and a definition of truth outside the state, which you highlight through the imagery of philosophy as being in the attic, where a difficult time one accumulates resources, lines up tools, and sharpens knives. I think this is a really powerful image because it evokes an accessible place outside in the sense that it embodies this sort of disregarded historical remnants that the attic kind of brings to the forefront, where one can collect their critical faculties and survey the landscape to better prepare for a forceful take-back and redefinition of what it means to be in the world. Only with this kind of careful preparation will it be possible to subvert perceptions of reality. Because as reinforced by Marcuse, I had to bring it up because I'm working on him on my second chapter of my thesis right now, we've been living in a one-dimensional reality that rationalizes irrationality. If what is known is inherently irrational, what needs to be accomplished is a subversion of known experience, through works like Am has so thoughtfully provided us. So thank you. Thank you.
Take part in the launch of his new book, and I've prepared a little statement that I'll read because I don't quite trust myself speaking off the cuff at 4 a.m. But it's mainly to contextualize ecological metapolitics and empathy, and why this step M has made to translate or transport some of Badiou's foundational concepts upon the sphere of contemporary ecology is really pressing. For those less familiar with Badiou's work, he's been a hugely important philosophical force since the late 60s, largely as an oppositional figure to the dominant trends of post-structuralism, so arguing for truth procedures and universality, while resurrecting Descartes and Plato in a period of history that championed the impossibility of truth as a liberatory vector. This is, of course, a sweeping caricature of structuralism that certainly generates many useful concepts as a response to the violence of modernism's colonial and capitalistic globalization. But Badiou was and is an instrumental thinker for helping us to overcome the limitations of these positions bound to relativism and particularity at the expense of thinking big. His is always a push if thinking. So in deploying Badiou as the philosophical figure through which to begin to parse the Promethean epistemic, political, and ethical challenge confronting us qua ecology, M demands us to think symmetrically on the side of the problems we face as a species. This is an important move for many urgent reasons, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just mention two. So the Curtis of Glacier, our practical incapacities reflect theoretical incapacities. So in that spirit, ecology today requires philosophical unpacking. Needs to not be left to pure idealisms of a nature to be protected, as seems quite a dominant line of thought in a lot of green politics. Nor can it be romanticized under principles of anarcho-primitivism, suggesting we return to our authentic roots of humanity, since humans are nature-culture tool beings. If we've known since the moderns that nature is not a mere backdrop upon which we perform, but a nature-culture matrix in the expression from Donna Haraway, then we cannot seriously engage ecology today without examining our concept of and for it. Furthermore, questions of time, definition of objects, economic organization, political mobilization, and the biophysical sciences are all entangled in the Anthropocene, demanding us to labor for apparatuses of cognitive traction in which philosophy is deployed as a discipline for synthesis across realms. And reason number 2, Badiou's core ideas get a necessary update for 21st century life and politics in order to seize the possibility for a new modern project, in his words, although personally I would prefer Fernando Zalamea's evocation of a modernism, but that's kind of another story. While deeply bound to Badiou's generic axiom, intellectually and methodologically, Am actually works and reveals to some degree the limitations of Badiou's thought in a productive way, seeing as he almost never addresses issues of climate change nor technology in political philosophy, which seems like a rather huge given our everyday reality. The heroic revolutionary insistence of Badiou's thought is generatively put into question through the addition of several thinkers well-versed in technology, like Benjamin Bratton and Nick Sterncheck. And although Adam sticks to the principles of militant fidelity, he questions the efficacy of Badiou's highly voluntaristic tone in view of our complex conditions that is no longer based on 19th century top-down models of power, but a systemic, tetra-headed, and distributed system. So I'll stop here and leave as much time as possible for Am and the others to talk us through his arguments in his own words, and thank you.
Titled Ecological Metapolitics or Decolonial Ecopolitics, Badiou Dialectics and the Problem of Difference. So I want to first start by acknowledging the unceded and therefore sovereign territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Because Indigenous communities are always disproportionately subject to the violence produced by our current ecological crisis, to my mind it's crucial both in terms of analysis but also the formation of our prescriptions to include Indigenous voices in these types of discussion. Am has always taken this seriously, and for this reason, among others, I consider him a close friend as well as a stellar ally. With this said, I would like to thank Am for first, writing this wonderfully challenging and thought-provoking book, and second, for inviting me and my fellow outstanding panelists here to join in this crucially important conversation on one of the core problems of our age, namely the ecological crisis spawned by the death drive of state and capital to undermine, indeed destroy, the foundation that underlies all life on this planet. When Am told me he was writing a dissertation and then a book that applies core concepts within the philosophical repertoire of Glen Coulthard, to not only make sense of our current ecological impasse, but also to perhaps formulate a militant politics that might radically transform it, I was skeptical to say the least. We'd be drinking beers and I'd snarkily but lovingly interrupt Am's pitch with some off comment about Badiou being the sloppy seconds of Louis Althusser and the rejected child of May 1968, who didn't make a name for himself outside the snobby circles of French Marxist theory until he was picked up by the folks at Verso, along with his co-national Jacques Rancière 10 or so years ago. Like all good books, though, Am's argument forced me to rethink my position, belligerent and admittedly ill-formed as it was. Like Matt, I had to dust off the Badiou in my bookshelves, of which there was only metapolitics and ethics. To my mind, ecological metapolitics convincingly unpacks and applies many core ideas within Badiou's body of work: subject and event, democratic materialism, affirmative dialectics, in a way that illuminates the confluence of state, capital, and ecological crisis that avoids the despair characteristic of more primitivist theories of collapse on the one hand, and the wishy-washy uselessness, if not complicity, of the liberal sustainability discourses on these issues on the other. This is not to say, however, that I'm wholly convinced. To get at my concern, I want to focus on the relationship between ecological denigration, settler coloniality, and what we might call a dialectics of sameness, which I worry that Badiou is unable, indeed willfully unwilling, to move beyond. Am explains Badiou's affirmative dialectics this way. Badiou proposes as a first sequence that philosophy as a means of thinking, change, should begin as an affirmative dialectic. To challenge Hegelian dialectics, he presents a model of philosophy that begins with an affirmation, but still employs negation after the initial affirmative sequence. Through its particular dialectical sequence, negation of the situational definition by the state and capital is achieved through affirmative construction. Badiou's case for an affirmative dialectic, then, is a twofold attempt to move beyond the limitation of Hegel's dialectic while working around Nietzsche's dialectic between ressentiment and affirmation. For Badiou, there's a problem in reinvesting logic inside of itself. There must be an affirmation of the positive before negation as the initial dialectical movement. Something of the future precedes the present. Quote, something of the future precedes the present. A dialectic that, quote, begins with an affirmation but still employs negation after the initial affirmative sequence. When examined in relationship to the recent resurgence of dialectical theorizing, this articulation initially excited me. From a decolonial perspective, as is so meticulously unpacked in the more recent work of George Cicarello-Mar, the tethering of dialectics to a determinism from which there appears no escape, and or from the hopelessly Eurocentric notions of stadio progress that have bogged them down, and or the tendency to prematurely privilege reconciliation and unity over the antagonistic combative moment of open rupture and conflict, has rendered it unappealing to folks working within both post and decolonizing traditions. Insofar as Badiou evades these fatalisms, Am aligns his work closer to that of Fanon, and in the text, flatteringly, even myself, than the Eurocentrism of, say, Marx and Zizek. But here I'm left to wonder if Badiou really breaks with this Eurocentric tradition enough, especially when it comes to a radical decolonial cultural politics positioned as the moment of self-affirmation and agency that refuses to be assimilated by the negation of settler state and capital as reconciliation. As Cicarello-Mar notes in his forthcoming Decolonizing Dialectics, Badiou, like Zizek, remains quite hostile to what Badiou refers to this ethics of difference, which he views as hopelessly anchored to a parochial statist multicultural capitalism, and instead praises a universalism that is fundamentally, quote, indifferent to difference, as Badiou states in Ethics. Now, to return to my opening territorial acknowledgement, if I suggest, as I suggested, indigenous communities are always disproportionately subject to the violence produced by our current ecological crisis, then to my mind it's crucial both in terms of our analysis but also our prescriptions to include substantively indigenous voices in these types of discussion. These voices, I venture to guess, will almost always articulate a form of decolonial dialectics that posits indigenous difference as something that ought not be transcended or assimilated in some higher synthesis or reconciliation or unity, but ought to remain vigilantly distinct. For in the assimilative machinery of settler colonial rule, it is this distinctiveness and the practices and forms of life that embodies and informs that we find potential solutions to the coloniality of our current anti-ecological condition. Thank you.
I first want to just thank Am for inviting me to participate in the conversation that we're having tonight. And next up, I want to thank him for writing a really great book. And I hope you all have a chance to read it at some point. So for me, I think Am really hit at what I think are some of the most crucial questions of our time. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic when I say that, but then I started thinking, do I think that he's asking some of the most important questions of our time because he is, or because I think about these questions all the time? So maybe it's a little bit of both. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that idea of what are the questions that Am's really asking in this book, and then just sort of three other things that this book made me think of, and maybe it can be like a choose your own adventure, Am, and you can answer one or two or three of them if there's time. So yeah, I mean, I think what Am explicitly set out to do was to sort of produce a diagnosis of this epic, as he says. in asking what is the time of this time. And more specifically, this book is about ecological metapolitics, but really in my mind it's about climate change specifically. And so he asks, what is the appropriate frame to consider climate change? And in my view, he does this by essentially answering that we do this by investigating the subject. I'm not a philosopher, but I definitely, through my work, come to see the problem that we're facing in this way. Am also brings up another series of parameters about the climate change issue that I think are critical, such as recognizing this problem as collective, if not highly unequal, and also underlining the extreme amounts of uncertainty and sort of existential questions that climate change brings up, as well as bringing up through the works of Patricia Reed and Deepesh Chakrabarty this idea that in asking what is the time of this time, we are forced to think of ourselves as geological creatures for the first time. Literally renaming epics after ourselves, because we're no longer just actors in nature in a biotic sense, but we're now actors in nature in a geological sense. So, but how does that relate back to questions of the subject? I think Am underscores the idea of social nature as being critical to answering that question. We're surrounded by the Latourian monsters of the social and the non-social having thoroughly mixed. Climate change is the ultimate monster that shows social nature as a fact. So even though nature will always exceed us, comprehending this moment, I believe, involves understanding that the future of nature, it literally depends on us, and more specifically depends on what kind of subjects we are or will become. So that to me was the really important questions that Alan's asking and answering. And so the sort of choose your own adventure part. Of course, when asking those sorts of questions, I start to think about the idea of consciousness. And he does touch on the idea of consciousness at a number of points. The idea that perhaps human beings are nature becoming conscious of itself. And for me, nothing else posits that possibility and the necessity of that than the moment we're in. So the first sort of line of thought that the book touches on that I would love to see more of is just the idea of nihilism. And you touched on this in a number of points in your book. And I was recently at a conference where a city councillor for a town in France was saying, the biggest problem right now isn't climate skepticism, it's climate nihilism. I was really struck by that. So I guess I'm left wondering, how do we think through nihilism and the kind of subject that is necessary for this time? It seems like a really huge obstacle. People seem to assume that we're just screwed, and I'm really fascinated by that and deeply troubled by it. I guess the second point is, at one point, Anne, you cite Badiou saying, we need to make sure that we're not messianic millenarists, and well, I am one of those. So I'm always interested in in thinking about climate change really since I was a kid. I've come kind of to that point where I'm like, wow, there's a new type of human being being demanded of this time. You talk a lot about, at one point, about the death of God, and I would like to ask if maybe what you're pointing at is, do we need to talk about the rebirth of God with a small g in there? So that's my new age stuff that I like to talk about. And then I guess the third thing is, obviously you cite Badiou at one point saying that whatever is new is a consequence of what now exists. But you also query what is inside and outside of the common ideology, as you call it right now. And I guess in reading this book, I was thinking through what I see now as very new changes. You started this project, I think, in 2012, maybe a little bit sooner, and I feel like so much has changed even since then. And I'm just really interested in the notion of can we see changes happening within inside capitalism that are actually that we really need to pay attention to? And I'm thinking specifically of forms of energy that essentially dematerialize energy, and whether or not this fundamentally changes the way we talk about capitalism in this kind of work. So, yeah, those are my choose your own adventure points. I think we have time to talk about it. Thank you.
And I'd like to open by acknowledging that we're doing this event on unceded Coast Salish territory, on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Stolo. And say thank you very much for their generosity in hosting us here. And I guess as well, on top of that, I'd like to thank Am. It's often my task at these events to be sentimental, and I take that job very seriously. I think I should say something that for so many of us, this dude brings so many of us together for so many events, so much of the time. And so I feel fantastic, and it feels great to be able to celebrate this book with him, and to be able to contribute in a very small way to that celebration. And I feel, I guess my dominant feeling, especially after dredging through Badu for the last week, was, shit, man, I'm just so proud of you, dude. It's a really, really hard task that you took on, right? So, I mean, in all kinds of ways, somebody in the middle, a middle-aged dude who is not a philosopher taking on a very complex philosophical problem and a gigantic philosophical project, and to my mind, succeeding tremendously. So I just kind of want to say, A, that we're proud of you, man. And I hope that you know how many people in this room are A, proud of you, and B, love you. So I want to say thank you. So when I was trying to figure out what the hell to say tonight, so I called them today and said, all right, so normally at these events, we should buy him a beer. But I said, after what you put me through this last week, man, yeah, you owe me a couple of beers, man. I haven't read about you for like decades, and I was like, I figured out why. So I said, look, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna ask you some questions, because I'm gonna ask you to clarify some points and ask some questions. And he says, well, you're probably not gonna be at the end, so I'm just gonna ignore the questions because you'll probably have forgotten them. And now, my friend, I am at the end, and so so I need you to answer these questions. And so I got a couple of pieces for you that I was working on, and I'm frankly unclear on, and I want both your clarification about Badiou, your clarification about your position and your interpretation of them. Badiou's kind of signature, I guess the piece that people often lock onto is his idea of the event. And he takes it in very particular ways, and it seems to change over the course of his scholarship, over the course of several decades, about what he means exactly by it. And like many of his ideas, they seem to be particularly malleable, given very particular kinds of instrumental ends that are difficult to follow sometimes. But for the large part, he describes an event as a very specific thing, a particular kind of rupture that seems to, in many ways, preclude a lot of small acts, a lot of everyday acts of resistance in particular. And his rendition of what constitutes an event seems to be unclear to me in many ways. And thus his theories of revolution appear to me to be very both insubstantive and too calcified. And so I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit to how you've interpreted the Badiouian event. Because in many cases, it seems to me that only very, very specific things, gigantic events. For example, you speak of for example, Arab Spring as maybe or maybe not constituting an event. And I'm hoping you could clarify that a little bit. Secondly, and I think this is closely related, is exactly Badiouian notion of nature. And in many ways, I am unclear again. And again, it seems to be a particularly malleable idea that moves through text about what exactly he, and I guess to some extent you, are calling nature. Are you speaking of nature as everything that is human? everything that is non-human? Or is humanity therefore part of nature, as Amelia suggests, part of nature that is becoming conscious of itself? Where exactly do you place nature and humans in some kind of contingent, some kind of necessary, some kind of symbiotic? What's your feeling there? My thinking over the years has tended to place humanity outside of nature as not part of nature in particular kinds of ways, and for particular kinds of reasons. And you and I have spoken to it many times. And I'm hoping to maybe you can just elucidate a little bit about your feelings about would you consider humanity as living or as existing within or outside of nature, or what that relationship looks like. And there's another sort of sub-question there. There's a particular set of sections where Badiou, and you quoting him, speak of nature as mute. And I think that's actually symptomatic of much of Badiou's writing, where he tends to speak of nature or the natural world as participating with a certain kind of univocality. And I am very suspicious of denying the creative potentiality and the subjectivity of the natural world. And so for me, that particular denial of the creativity embedded in the natural world as a multiplicity rather than a univocality seems to be particularly problematic for an ecological politics. And if you feel like speaking that, that'd be gold. And finally, as many people are familiar, I guess, probably much more familiar than I am, is that for much of his, in particular earlier career, Badiou evinced a particular kind of quasi-Maoist, very mechanistic, vanguardist notion of change and revolution. Speaking very directly out of an Althusserian structuralist tradition, there appears to be a very particular set of ideas about what revolution might constitute, and in particular the idea of a vanguardist potentiality that it seems to me to be real problematic in lots of ways. And again, not dissimilar to his notion of event, seems to discourage, if not dismiss, everyday acts of resistance in all those notions, and not just even everyday acts, but acts of resistance and revolution that are not constitute a quasi event or a rupture in our consciousness. So is that an event? A particular kind of rupture. And I guess I should say, finally, that I guess it's a compliment, because to you, Anne, which is really to say that after a considerable effort put in reading a whole bunch of texts that I dragged out of the basement, I should say that your book was kind of a drink of cool water on a hot day, man. I really enjoyed it. It was readable, it was thoughtful, it contained a whole lot of things, it brought in a whole lot of separate threads, and I think it brought in a tremendous amount, and maybe made a couple of really important contributions to not just the Badouian thought, but to ecological thinking, and to particular routes that I am attempting to take to think about, not just about ecology, but the notion, my long-held kind of notion that you've heard me say too often, but the domination of the natural world is necessarily predicated on the domination of humans by human, and to think that through in terms of not just a philosophical project, but as a revolutionary project. So thanks, and you're up, Amen.
I just want to thank everyone who agreed to be on this panel. Yesterday I tried to go back to reading the book to get prepared for today, because it's been several months, but I literally fell asleep reading my own work, so this glass of water on a hot day, Matt, didn't work for me. But thank you so much, Kavita. She's doing amazing work around Marx and nature, and Marcuse. Some of her work is in the Institute for Humanities, the latest journal that was put out after the anti-mining conference. And thank you so much, Patricia, for being there in Berlin right now at 4:40 and 4:50 in the morning. And Glen, once again, just one of the people who I've learned so much from just by drinking beer with him, to organizing events that he's been a part of. I think he's doing such important, fascinating work that's going to be important for a long time, and we're really lucky to have him here in the city, interacting in the way that he does, not just in the academy, but out in the real world. And Amelia, thank you as well. I know you're in the middle of your dissertation, and it's been great having conversations with you over the last number of years around your work. And Matt, of course, we just went on a road trip up to Fort McMurray, Alberta, with a friend, and we had a great time together, and we're working on some projects. But great to have these questions and this type of solidarity with people. And I guess one of the things I want to mention, just as a kind of background to the work, is that it very much is a Vancouver work, and it's something that I feel like was written collectively. I'm really somebody who comes from outside of the academy, and I entered into doing theory in my late 30s, in my middle ages, because I was frankly quite exhausted from politics, from community organizing, from being involved. And to me, I needed a kind of outside to think through problems politically again, but I really needed a break from politics. It was in that kind of post-Olympic moment, and to be taking classes up in the mountains of Switzerland was a strange kind of privilege. But at the same time, my master's had been in international economic relations. I was thinking through a project that involved Foucault and geopolitics, and I was thinking about bringing in some climate change into that. But back in 2012, Badu had done a seminar where for a couple of days he talked about the question of change, the task of the old man, and talked about specifically the notion of change and tradition, and specifically brought up the question of climate change and where it fits in. And it was quite an amazing seminar to be a part of, and it affected many of us that were there, not being a specialist in his work, and also being a little bit frustrated by the fact that when he was pointedly asked about climate change, he oftentimes didn't give a fulsome answer. But in that seminar, he did go on into it for a couple of days that allowed a bit of an opening. It was an oral transmission rather than a written piece of work, but there was a Canadian student named Dwayne Roussel from Trent University who actually transcribed that seminar. So it allowed for an opening to get into some of these questions. And so that's where the project kind of began. And in many respects, when I say it was written collectively, it's that when your advisor is Alain Badu, you don't necessarily get a lot of time with him. So I really relied on people here in Vancouver who helped to edit, who helped challenge some of the things that I was writing, particularly trying to write in an academic frame when that's not really your comfort zone was the big challenge, and working full-time in the process of doing that. I was luckily able to take a couple of months off, and that allowed the project to be completed. But people like Samir helped read through some early documents. I was able to give a talk through the Institute for Humanities, and a number of people here in this room helped to edit as well. So I really, without that, I certainly wouldn't be here putting out a book at this stage. I was sitting in the back, so I didn't hear the questions, Matt, that you asked. But I'll get into a couple of pieces and maybe open it up to a few questions before we go to the bar. I'm just gonna... Yeah, this question I go through in the first chapter of the book, and it really derives directly from Badu's seminar around this relationship between tradition and change. And he places the environmental question as a kind of continuation of a type of tradition and a type of change that sides on the conservative side of change as opposed to a revolutionary tradition, which is a kind of pure change. And he places the type of change that exists within the capitalist tradition also as a type of change. And so a lot of the first chapter is parsing through these differences of what constitutes a change, what's a true change. And this question that one of you brought up around the relationship between humanity and nature and where the human fits in. There's discussion from a Marxist kind of point of view. There's some discussion around the Enlightenment tradition about the human desire to dominate nature. There's some discussion of the Frankfurt School unpacking of that. But Badu is quite clear in his seminars, and I use that as a launching point, which is that, yes, we might be in the Marxist tradition, humans, by interacting with nature, produce nature. Nature acts upon humans. Humans act upon on nature. But Badiou says at the end, nature does not speak, which might be a debatable point. But basically, that the problem of climate change has been created largely by humans, and to unpack and to get out of that situation requires a human response. It's not going to be the deer or the antelope or the trees that will respond to the situation that's been created. That's certainly a debatable point, but that's his position, and that's sort of partly what I'm parsing through. I think the area that brought me to the project partially as well, besides kind of not being happy with Badiou's response when he was asked about climate change, was to force him into the question. But secondly, there was also, in looking through environmental ethics and environmental philosophy, a deep frustration about that whole area not getting to the stakes, getting to what was at stake. So if you go through environmental ethics readers, you have a lot of talk about, should we recycle, should we do this, should we, it ends up being a kind of discussion of personal ethics, which tends to be, in my view, very much in a kind of nihilist frame. And so to me, it didn't get to what I felt were the questions that needed to be asked. So Badiou, of course, known as a theorist of militant political change, I felt had some interesting things to say to disrupt environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. But also in bringing him into it and him being my advisor, I also was kind of a bit cowardly and chicken shit on some matters. And I think specifically I didn't really get far enough into the question of whether climate change constitutes an event or not. In the Badiouian kind of ontology, he would argue that truths appear in 4 specific areas: politics, love, science, and art. And we could argue that climate change is a new truth in the field of science, or we could argue that it's a new event fully. The third area that Badiou's kind of known for is set theory and category theory. This is when he brings math into philosophy. So those are entire chapters which I glazed over and certainly was not going to become an expert on in short order. So in terms of bringing Badiou into the question of ecology, I think where it can be taken further, and certainly by people who are much more invested in set theory and category theory, is to kind of open up that space to see what might be plausible. In terms of the critique that Glen brought up, it's absolutely the question. When you look at the environmental movement today, it's still a largely bourgeois white movement in terms of actual organizing on the ground, and any kind of movement around climate change, if it doesn't have an indigenous lens, isn't true to its name in terms of actual facts on the ground, in terms of ways of organizing, ways of mobilizing, ways of seeing, and ways of having a relationship to the land and to nature. And I think that the work that's being produced with that decolonization lens is absolutely essential to thinking through it. And I would agree that Badiou's relationship to decolonization very much begins in the Algerian question in the early 60s and largely hasn't been renovated since then. And his kind of attempt to create a kind of universalism that incorporates it, which is a kind of radical relationship to equality, of course, is problematized by its premise, particularly with a decolonization lens. So there's a whole series of things there that I think need to be unpacked further, and I don't get into enough in the book beyond bringing Glen's work into it. I think I'm going to leave it there, but I think I might just read a page from the book just to give people a flavor for a bit of the background. Within ecology, generational debts are projected onto an imaginary future, and moral claims to do what is right in the present violently conflict with capitalist culture's mode of operation, i.e. with the development of contemporary desire, the perpetual pursuit of instant gratification. Within this dilemma is the question, I just have this life to live, and what should I do with it? For Sayers, because the earth is being transformed by our doing, it has a subject once again. He writes, "This crisis of foundations is not an intellectual crisis. It does not affect our ideas or language or logic or geometry, but time and weather and our survival." Badiou, following Lacan, says, "Do not give up on your desire." He argues that we must live the true life in support of the idea. Within the symptomatic torsion of its limit point is the metabolic field of play between humanity and nature. To work around it or to move through the problem of ecology, however, we will need a reawakening. We may not need something new, but we may need to bring back to life something dormant today, which is a reinvention of something familiar. That reinvention is a desire for a new modern tradition, a non-capitalist modernity, a repetition on the side of the continuation of nature that acknowledges its living interaction with humanity and other living beings in the world, while acknowledging the singularity of the human capacity to destroy life on Earth. Inscribed within ecological metapolitics is an attempt to listen closely to this notion of political change and to subtract oneself from the structure of what has traditionally been referred to as environmental philosophy, a field that represents a closure to thinking change regarding the question of ecology today. Ecological metapolitics is an intervention to identify what is different than what came before regarding the politics of ecology, and to locate change in the movement from the present to the future that has equality as its basis. In the arrhythmic variations and dialectical movements of global systems, we remain imprisoned in narrow, localized earthly domains. Amidst the immediate reckonings of these localized orbits, we may have already lost the world. Nature is exacting revenge as a form of justice, as a substitute for other means of adjudication, for they do not yet exist in adequate form. It is the task of philosophy to determine what are the new questions to be asked today. In order to truly live in this world, for Badiou, there is a call for a fundamental transformation and a new orientation to discover the true life and existence as such through fidelity to the event. It remains the task of philosophy to not accept the world as it is, to construct the outlines of a new impossible world. It is a desire to invent something fundamentally new. For Badiou, philosophy is ultimately axiom-based. So let us end then with these axioms as our counter-signature for ecological metapolitics today. Philosophy must speak in its own name as a poetic articulation of the true life. The hypothesis for an ecological vision today requires a new subject and a non-capitalist modernity. The desire for revolution is ultimately a desire for justice. We are nothing, let us be everything. The world needs a new kind of love that is part of a new modern tradition, a love beyond nature that is a universe, a love of the infinite that is the secret truth of the world for all.